Story 1. I assume most of the world would impose sanctions on the United States like they did with Russia, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would probably dissolve or the United States would be expelled since this would be one NATO nation attacking another, and technically other NATO nations would need to respond. Story 2. Maersk, a Danish company, is the second largest shipping company in the world. They could embargo any shipments to the United States, refuse port operations for anything going to the United States, and the situation would be resolved in a matter of days. They could effectively shut down the United States economy. Story 3. I can see a domino effect occurring, where China will consider annexing Taiwan as the United States becomes distracted by Greenland and the rest of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Story 4. The United States has hundreds of international military bases that support its soft power. I imagine that those would all be gone. Countries like Germany, Japan, the Philippines, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy would no longer have a military presence. In fact, just Donald Trump implying military action instead of orchestrating political change has significant political ramifications. This shows that America has lost its soft power. Story 5. There was another post when the whole annexing Greenland situation started, where a retired United States military officer stated that troops would likely surrender en masse and possibly mutiny if ordered to invade Canada or Greenland. Story 6. NATO will dissolve and be replaced by a European defense alliance, likely including Canada as well. The United States will be perceived as a rogue state. The boycott United States movement will grow stronger and more widespread. American tourists may not be welcomed anywhere in the world. The U.S. economy will suffer immensely, and the military-industrial complex will also experience significant losses as European sales vanish overnight. The damage will last for generations, as the world will always think, Americans are only one election away from electing another Trump. Trust will be irreparably destroyed. The U.S. may not have a single ally or friend anywhere in the world, except maybe Israel and possibly Russia. The only hope is that the American public will take a stand against this situation while they still have the right to protest. However, time is running out. Story 7. NATO would begin the process of withdrawing all United States troops from Europe and encourage European trading partners to do the same, which would include Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. China would use the annexation to justify a forcible takeover of Taiwan and the annexation of territory in the South China Sea. Russia would similarly justify its own expansion. Both Germany and Japan would leverage the annexation to justify the rearmament of their countries. Non-aligned large countries like India and Brazil would likely align themselves with anti-United States factions globally. Any country that signed nuclear non-proliferation treaties and has the potential to develop nuclear weapons would immediately use the invasion of Greenland to justify their own security measures and begin working on building nuclear capabilities. This includes Pakistan, India, Iran, Israel, South Africa, North Korea, and several former Soviet states. In other words, little to nothing would happen in Greenland itself. The landmass is practically indefensible due to the ice cap. However, the stability of the rest of the world, which largely relies on the perceived intentions of the United States as a global peacekeeper following World War II, would be severely undermined. As a nation, we would have violated a trust that has existed for 80 years, which, once lost, will never be re-earned. Story 8. I believe that major powers, including Russia, the United States, and China, have collectively decided that the era of stability has ended, and we are returning to a situation where might makes right and land grabs are likely. It is not a good time to be a small, vulnerable country unless you are part of a much larger alliance like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which may also be tested. Sitting in Georgia or Moldova right now is not reassuring, as neither is a member of NATO, and both face challenges with Russia, which may resolve these issues using their significant military force after their involvement in Ukraine. The implications are more wars and land grabs worldwide, potentially leading to a large-scale conflict, such as the United States attacking China over Taiwan. Story 9. Article 5 of NATO would be triggered, and Russia would have the opportunity to watch and prepare for a second front against Europe. Story 10. I am ashamed to be American. Are we really at that point? Has Fox News influenced this many Americans? Story 11. As a veteran, I believe it would cause a major crisis within our military. A premeditated attack on an ally would not be well received in the ranks. Our senior leadership began their careers in the final days of the Cold War, and the value of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is deeply ingrained in their beliefs. I think in order to invade Greenland could actually lead to a military revolt. Story 12. Trump is influenced by a group of neo-feudalists like Vance who want to completely upend the post-World War II neoliberalism that established an international order through a variety of mechanisms like the United Nations, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, World Health Organization, World Bank, and other institutions built around global cooperation. The idea behind globalization was to prevent war through economic development and to eliminate conflict by creating improved financial and social conditions for both allies and adversaries. Forcibly annexing Greenland, pressuring Canada, imposing massive tariffs on trading partners, applying mercantilism to military intervention, isolationism, and extreme nationalism by the United States will likely return us to a world that resembles the 1930s and 1940s. Alliances will form, and the world will become much more fragmented. Conflicts will be harder to prevent or resolve. Trade will become more difficult, and there will be incentives to seize necessary resources by force. This could lead to a new Cold War between the United States and China as threats of nuclear annihilation increase. This new era will likely be marked by disputes over climate change migration, military actions over resources and water, including Greenland, global energy crises, and violent xenophobia. If you were wondering what the world was like right before the Mad Max movies started, we are getting pretty close. Story 13. Taiwan is in a difficult situation. Ukraine is facing challenges. NATO is under pressure. Denmark is struggling. The United States is in a tough position. Greenland is in a critical state. The global economy is facing serious issues. This represents a significant global crisis with minimal gains and high costs. It likely wouldn't lead to an actual war because the United States is very powerful and could exert influence over Denmark, but it would be unwise and could damage the United States' reputation in the global system that has been built over the past 80 years with significant investment in money, time, and effort. Story 14. For most of human history, it was considered completely natural and perfectly acceptable for a larger country to conquer and subjugate a smaller neighbor simply to enrich itself. After World War II, the world came to an agreement that this should change and that a good and just reason is required before going to war. Now, the leaders of the three largest nuclear powers declare that we are reverting to the old ways. However, Putin and Xi at least provided a few justifications to create a false reason for invading Ukraine or Taiwan. Trump does not even bother with that. "We want it" is now sufficient. This will greatly encourage all smaller powers that intend to invade their even smaller neighbors to seize their resources. Story 15. The most likely reaction I foresee is that the European members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would take advantage of the fact that the companies controlling container shipping to the United States are predominantly European. Maersk, for example, is Danish and the second largest shipping company in the world. If the goods stop coming into the United States, their economy could collapse. This could lead to mass civil unrest or even civil war, which would benefit the European NATO members in this scenario. Naturally, it would also end virtually every pre-existing United States alliance across the globe. I cannot imagine countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and others trusting the United States after such an act. The dollar would lose its value and be replaced by a mixture of various other currencies. In short, it would be a disaster for the United States and, to a large extent, for the rest of the world as well. It would mark the definitive end of an era. Story 16. It would be bad. Locals would retaliate and it would escalate. People would be harmed and social media would make it go viral. The world would turn against America. Now what? Story 17. Theoretically, it is an attack on a North Atlantic Treaty Organization member. So the European Union and Canada declare war. Practically, the European Union stops trade with the United States, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is replaced by a new European Defense Pact. Story 18. War with NATO. We would not fare well against the whole world, and having Russia and North Korea as allies is a poor idea. However, this administration seems to prioritize foolish decisions. Story 19. According to Vance, They want a military presence to deter Russia and China. Don't we already have military bases in Greenland? Or were they abandoned? Story 20. Are Americans really going to follow an order that asks them to attack a peaceful country? Civil war is something that could happen, as well as World War III. Story 21. Getting America to turn against NATO has been Putin's fantasy for decades. All he had to do was choose a populace to advance his agenda and establish several troll farms to influence the most gullible portion of our country. Story 22. All shifts get lost. China goes for Taiwan. North Korea goes for South Korea. Russia goes for the Baltics. A myriad of smaller wars where a larger country wants a piece of a smaller one. Israel and Gaza, parts of Syria and Lebanon, Serbia and Hungary, parts of Croatia, Bosnia and Kosovo, Turkey versus Greece, and parts of Syria, Bulgaria and North Macedonia, etc. If Trump goes for Greenland by force, he will go for Canada too. The relative peace we had since World War II until the second Trump term is not the norm in world history. It was just our grandfathers deciding they would respect each other's boundaries after the horrors they experienced during World War II. That memory has faded, creating a breeding ground for dictators wanting territory and their statues. Story 23. I hope I am correct in saying that Donald Trump would not have the congressional vote to declare war on Greenland, and if he tried to annex it by force, he would lose support, possibly even enough to face impeachment. I do not know many voters who would be pleased by a declaration of war. His other policies are a different matter, but I believe he would lose significant support. It is a shame that this is what America has become. Story 24. Annexing Greenland through military force would place the United States in a state of war against Denmark and, by extension, the entire European Union. This action would likely lead to significant unrest both domestically in the United States and within the European Union, resulting in a complete freeze in relations between the United States and much of the world. While the European Union may not be able to effectively stop the United States, there would be a complete severing of relationships between the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, potentially extending to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan as well. It is possible that the United Kingdom and the European Union would deploy military assets to protect Canada. Story 25. What happens? World War III, European Union and North Atlantic Treaty Organization versus the United States. Maybe the US teams up with Russia, and maybe North Korea makes the poor decision to join that as well, but I don't believe China would be so foolish. Then, extremists discover that the most expensive is not synonymous with the biggest or strongest, and the reality is that the US military-industrial complex has been overcharging the US for weapons that are still intended to combat underarmed terrorists in desert caves, not a modern military. Also, considering recent news, the invasion will likely be leaked 2 hours before departure on signal, and the intelligence agencies of the European Union and North Atlantic Treaty Organization will be aware of it because no one in the White House is listening to the IT personnel. Story 26. The United States special status has ended. We are no longer seen as the trusted leader for those who believe they have moved beyond war for gain, leading to the erosion of our assumed leadership in various areas. Nuclear non-proliferation will likely be one of the long-term losses. Taiwan could be lost at China's earliest convenience. Story 27. America suddenly becomes the aggressor in a world where it was supposed to be the reasonable superpower of democracy. I imagine that would cause significant disruption, especially as America has worked to Americanize basically everything and everyone. Story 28. America versus everyone. The South Park episode writes itself. They would have stereotypes on battleships. Story 29. It seems that many people are missing a significant part of the picture regarding Greenland. Trump is interested in Greenland because Peter Thiel wants it for Project Praxis, which aligns with the white nationalists' vision of controlling the entire Northwest Hemisphere. Panama, Mexico, and Canada have all been targeted in various ways by Trump and his group of officials because they desire control over these regions. Musk, Thiel, and others who subscribe to the so-called Dark Enlightenment view this as an opportunity to realize their ambitions. When you add Putin's desire to isolate the United States from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it becomes easier to understand the chaos that is unfolding and why Trump's advisors continue to escalate conflicts in multiple directions. Story 30. NATO would be required to oppose. One of the easiest ways to do so would be to seize all of our military bases and assets in NATO allied countries. There is no logical way we could support, defend, or evacuate even a fraction of them spread across Europe while invading Greenland. It would be the single largest loss of equipment, service members, and intelligence in military history. Story 31. I believe any military aggression against Greenland or Canada would initiate a civil conflict within the United States. Story 32. NATO would invoke Article 5 and bombing runs in Washington, D.C. would begin. At least that is how it should work. Story 33. Essentially, World War III would trigger Article 5 in NATO, and we would be at war with all of Europe. I hope there are enough sane people in the military to prevent this from happening. Story 34. America relies on its global perception, which plays a significant role in our ability to influence international matters. Any substantial shift in this perception has financial implications that are difficult to quantify. Story 35. This situation gives China, Israel, Russia, and any despotic country the green light to invade other nations without facing consequences. It creates a very dangerous environment for the world. I don't think people fully appreciate the gravity of this situation. Story 36. No more access through multiple channels. Sanctions are imposed globally. Every United States military base in North Atlantic Treaty Organization territory is seized, and their staff is escorted out of the country. United States visas are canceled in several countries, and citizens are interned or escorted out of the country. The United States is completely cut out of many foreign markets. The United States is asked to repay all its international debts. Germany requests the return of all its missing gold. The United States is forced to deal with all its plastic waste rather than exporting it. The southern United States runs out of power during the next winter as Canada no longer exports electricity to them. Taiwan refuses to ship any more chips to the United States or produce any on their soil, and their skilled workers are withdrawn, completely shutting down United States access to new chips outside of black markets at a highly inflated price. Lithium exporters are offered better prices than the United States is paying for their supply, along with large investments in exchange for supply. The United States is cut out of everything and must realize that almost everything they have at this point is due to global cooperation. They either need to reverse course completely and seek any pathway back into good graces with the international community or face exclusion from all forms of international decision-making, except those involving rebuilding the United States to a reasonable standard of living for its citizens. Story 37. America would trigger Article 5 against itself. Keep in mind that the only other time Article 5 has ever been invoked was by the United States after September 11, 2001. Story 38. Article 5 and Article 8 of the North Atlantic Treaty are activated, leading to other North Atlantic Treaty Organization members coming to the defense of Denmark and Greenland, while the United States is removed from the organization. Story 39. The treaty does not include any explicit provisions regarding member countries attacking one another. Story 40. In the short term, a war between the United States and Europe is unlikely, primarily because Europe does not possess the capability to confront the United States, especially far from its own territory. It is possible, however, that the United States might be expelled from NATO, or NATO could dissolve and a new European alliance could form. There would likely be a significant increase in defense spending across Europe, Canada, and Mexico, as Europe transitions from a moderate pace of rearmament to a rapid acceleration, realizing that the United States has become an adversary. A European nuclear program could emerge as a response. Economic sanctions against the United States from Europe, Canada, and potentially many other countries would severely impact the global economy. The value of the US dollar might plummet as numerous countries withdraw their funds from US securities, leading to a substantial flow of money to China. In the United States, massive protests would likely occur in urban areas, with possible demonstrations in some rural regions. This could trigger a backlash from the Trump administration, resulting in an even stronger shift toward authoritarianism. A significant resistance movement might arise in Greenland, potentially involving protests and local violence, as occupying a population that is united against you can be challenging. The United States would likely need to deploy a large number of troops for counterinsurgency operations, who might become disillusioned while fighting in a hostile environment with no clear justification for their presence. This scenario could resemble Iraq, but with even less rationale for military involvement and a population that closely resembles the soldiers. Over the long term, the Trump administration might implode as factions within the Republican Party push back against extreme measures, or full authoritarianism could take hold, leading to the persecution of dissenters and potentially a civil war or fascist state. A more powerful China and a more unified Europe could emerge, albeit with significant financial challenges as they redirect a substantial portion of their budgets towards defense. There could be a global realignment, with many countries gravitating towards the European Union or China, as the United States is currently struggling to maintain alliances. A recession or depression in the United States might ensue, especially if its major trading partners withdraw, leaving it without viable replacements. Story 41. If we do that, I'm guessing the rest of the world will follow. This time, a world war will be fought on American soil. We will observe the supporters of the Make America Great Again movement put their money where their mouths are. Story 42. We would likely become a pariah state similar to Russia and North Korea, facing sanctions and trade limitations from other countries. This would be an economic disaster. Story 43. Instant war. I do not believe Europe and Canada would not respond immediately. They should, considering that at that point, it will be a race to cut off the heads of the Hydra before it takes bites out of them. International tensions are truly at an all-time high. Story 44. That will never happen. The felon only talks about it, so no one notices him stealing the gold from Fort Knox. Story 45. Greenland is under the administration of Denmark, which is a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. One of the tenets of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is that if you attack one member, you attack them all. Members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization include Albania, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Montenegro, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. Thus, a global conflict may arise. Story 46. America would face sanctions, crippling the economy. Global pressure would lead to the removal of military bases. The world's governments would not permit it, and it would be political suicide. Story 47. It's like a high school senior picking a fight with a toddler. It won't end well for the senior when everyone steps in to help the toddler. Story 48. We would be in violation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, of which we are a member. This is the most dangerously absurd situation I believe has ever occurred in the history of the United States. Story 49. Let us assume that Denmark invokes Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. It follows that the member nations either fulfill their obligations or do not. For the purposes of this discussion, let us say all members decide to declare war. Militarily, there is the decision to use nuclear weapons or not. The United Kingdom and France possess nuclear arms and have the capability to target much, if not all, of the United States. The United States also has a significant nuclear arsenal and could potentially annihilate the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Otherwise, it would be challenging for NATO to seriously threaten the U.S. homeland in the short term. There are many Americans in Europe, including military personnel and their families. At best, they would be interned until after the conflict. Economically, NATO members would cease trade, which would harm the United States more, as NATO has the capability to interdict shipping in the Atlantic, including the transport of oil imports to the eastern seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico. While the United States would withhold exports, the absence of American foodstuffs would negatively impact many European countries. However, Europe would likely adjust, and the United States would face challenges in interdicting shipping of Europe-bound trade goods, including foodstuffs. Such actions could involve nations from South America, Africa, and Asia, which would likely not be beneficial for the United States. Except, the U.S. could potentially write off much of its national debt and balance of payments issues with those countries that hold U.S. treasuries and other notes. Diplomatically, the U.S. would be shunned, much like Russia currently is. Americans may not care or notice. The interesting aspect is how China and Russia perceive the American capitalistic takeover of the peace-loving people of Greenland. In all likelihood, they would remain neutral and be prepared to pick up the pieces or become opportunistic, finishing the situation in Ukraine and targeting Taiwan and other Asian countries in the name of greater security, the pretense the United States used to justify the takeover of Greenland. In terms of information, the United States would declare anything contrary to supporting its aims as fake news. However, prolonged wars in the Middle East and Southwestern Asia have led many countries and individuals to distrust America. It is likely that the U.S. would lose the hearts and minds of everyone who isn't American, and even in the U.S., some citizens might pose an internal security concern. I consider all of this the most probable outcome. I doubt that the American takeover of Greenland by force would be successful. The best-case scenario for the U.S. is that nobody, other than Greenlanders, cares and the takeover is successful. However, the world would likely be distrustful of future American initiatives, NATO could fall apart, and a new world order may emerge. The worst-case scenario is that the attempt fails, leading to significant U.S. losses in treasure and lives, with no positive outcome. The absolute worst outcome would be global thermonuclear war. Realistically, some individuals will die and nobody wins. Instead, how about a nice game of chess? Story 50. China invades Taiwan, and Russia invades Eastern Europe. The United States loses all its current allies and is forced to turn to a new axis, crippling its economy and transferring global power to China in the process. Then the new allies fight against this axis, United States and Russia, in World War III, and the world is never the same. China likely takes Taiwan and uses its soft power to build an empire while the United States and Russia exhaust themselves fighting against the entire world. Story 51. An international boycott of United States Treasury bonds and a coordinated effort by various countries to offload their holdings is likely. Countries will be limited in their ability to impose economic and financial measures due to the military strength of the United States. Story 52. I believe it is part of Putin's larger strategy. Canada and Denmark, Greenland, realistically have no chance of defending themselves militarily. However, if one does resist, it could create grounds for conflict, leading to a declaration of war by the United States. In such a case, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would be compelled to engage alongside the United States. While this might not result in extensive fighting, it would necessitate that the organization shift focus to its own defense, ultimately providing significantly less support for Ukraine, which could enable Russia to succeed in its military objectives. That's my assessment of the situation. Story 53. Green light for America's adversaries. Russia will continue to invade Ukraine, the Baltic states, and then Europe. China will invade Taiwan, the Philippines, and the Indo-Pacific region. They will argue that if the United States can invade, then so can they, especially given the weak leadership under Trump. Non-NATO countries will be extremely vulnerable, which is why Putin fears Ukraine joining NATO. Story 54. Greenland remains part of the Council of Europe and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as part of Denmark. Let's discuss Article 5 of the NATO Pact. Story 55. Any plans to invade a friendly country will result in a division within the military. Such actions can lead to unrest or even civil war. Story 56. The amount of European Union economic sanctions could shut down the United States so rapidly that people will revolt against Trump and end his actions. Story 57. Denmark is a member of NATO, and it is likely that they will invoke Article 5. Many, if not all, other members of the treaty will respond, if not with direct military conflict, which currently feels unimaginable, then at least with severe sanctions and a significant reduction in ties with the United States. Essentially, the United States will be treated by European countries and Canada in a manner similar to how Iran is treated today by the United States. Story 58. First and least dramatically, America would likely not enter into another alliance or treaty with any nation other than Russia for at least a century. Story 59. They would isolate themselves completely on the world stage. Europe would expel them from all countries on the continent. A possible war between the European Union and the United States could occur. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization would need to reorganize. Putin would fully commit to Ukraine. China might pursue Taiwan. World War III could happen, and Australians would still be confused. Story 60. I think the United States wouldn't recover from this attempt. Their own military is speaking out against the actions of their government. These soldiers fought alongside European soldiers as allies. They don't want to turn on them as invaders. Trade is already declining for them. How do they expect to sustain a war when allied forces will push back? Everyone is searching for alternatives for trade due to the tariffs being implemented. And it's challenging to keep tactical military operations secret with this leadership. Story 61. It would be significant. The United States would essentially be attacking Europe. Hopefully, someone close to the individual in question will give him a wake-up call and set him straight, perhaps a general. Story 62. Every military base worldwide will eventually be shut down. No one will host the United States military again. Story 63. I believe many people will wake up. Americans will realize they will not be able to go to Europe for the summer, or their businesses may suffer significantly. We might witness a civil war or something similar to the Union breaking up. Story 64. The complete destruction of the United States economy as we know it. The shattering of America. The end of the world order we take for granted as a nation. Complete nonsense. Story 65. As an American, I honestly feel scared to express my hopes for how the world should respond. I need help to correct our course at this point. I used to be so proud of my country, but now I feel just sad. Story 66. Geopolitical disaster breaks international law, sparks sanctions, weakens NATO, and fuels anti-American sentiment. Economically, it is a mess characterized by trade chaos and a resistant population. The United States gains ice and loses power. Story 67. It would be an act of war against a North Atlantic Treaty Organization country. Who wants the North Atlantic Treaty Organization weakened the most? Putin. Name something a Russian asset would do to hurt America that Trump hasn't already stated he would do. Story 68. Annex? You mean invade? It would cause a war. NATO would be forced to expel the United States and defend Greenland. 2 other NATO member states are armed with nuclear weapons. Story 69. NATO would respond to an attack on its members. Countries with soldiers who died for America in Afghanistan would engage American soldiers. British and German submarines would disrupt shipping on the East Coast, shutting down America's economy. French submarines would launch missiles from far out at sea to destroy military targets on the East Coast. This would lead to a massive military disaster for the United States. There would be significant economic destruction for the United States. War and loss of life on American soil would result in massive losses. What happens if France loses a submarine? What happens if Britain loses an aircraft carrier task force? What happens if Germany loses a submarine and some air assets? America's economy would collapse, and its eastern seaboard would be devastated, resulting in massive loss of life and military strength. The only explanation that seems plausible is that the former president is taking orders from the Russian president. That is the only theory that holds any weight. Story 70. I saw an article a few days ago where Trump said NATO would help him take Greenland. He is clueless. Story 71. If NATO does not respond with military action, they certainly will with economic boycotts and sanctions. In fact, most of the global community will as well. Story 72. It would be declaring war on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so our only options for allies would be Russia, China, and North Korea. It would then become completely clear that the United States is no longer a democratic republic and has become a despotic warmonger. Story 73. If the United States invaded Greenland with military force, the current world order would visually collapse in front of you in real time. The United States would have to withdraw from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization first, considering it would be violating its own agreements if it did so. Denmark would invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, meaning all NATO allies would have to fight the United States. Let's be realistic here. The European Union and NATO can't even passively support Ukraine, ran out of missiles within a week in Libya, and can't pass legislation for financial support. They stand zero chance. So likely, Greenland would instantly be lost to the United States. The United States would probably then be marked as an aggressor nation, similar to Russia after Crimea. Alliances would fracture and countries would start to impose sanctions. Russia and China would celebrate in the Arctic and Pacific. China would advance into Taiwan, potentially advising allies to invade South Korea and possibly Japan in the future. Russia would push towards Arctic and Baltic nations, knowing that the European Union cannot defend itself. Internal chaos would ensue, as likely more than half the population would be against annexing allies. This would be an easy win for the United States strategically, but a politically unmitigated disaster. It also sets up for a new world in half a century where giant nations simply allow smaller ones to exist until their purpose ceases. Story 74. If the United States decides to annex Greenland, here is what happens. The United States' reputation would be severely damaged. The United States would lose all its allies. All trade relations with the United States would cease, and significant economic sanctions would be imposed by former allies. There is no precedent for a NATO member attacking another, but it is likely that the United States would lose its NATO seat. At that point, Article 5 would be enacted, leading to all NATO countries being at war with the United States. This situation would result in a weaker and poorer United States, a weaker and poorer NATO, and former allies of the United States that are not part of NATO becoming weaker and poorer as well. The only countries that would benefit from this scenario are Russia and China. Story 75. Read up on World War II and the events leading up to it. It answers most questions about the current leader and the consequences of whether he followed through on anything he said. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.